I don't think we often realize how important sugar was for the economy of the 18th century. Indeed, it's said that sugar was as important for the economy of the 18th century as iron and steel was for the 19th century and oil for the 20th century. And after the acquisition of Jamaica by Britain in the 1650s, and then the growth of the sugar industry, Britain becomes more and more involved in the transatlantic slave trade because sugar production was very labor intensive. And so you have millions indeed of black people being taken from West Africa, especially, over to the New World. And in the case of Britain, to the Caribbean, especially. And there was really fairly little protest about this, despite the fact that it was a terrible and cruel trade. The trade was triangular. What happened was that ships would leave Britain, usually mainly from the ports of Bristol and Liverpool, and they would take goods with them to purchase slaves, because contrary to the popular imagination, what happened in the case of most of the slaves was that they were actually purchased from fellow Africans, purchased with things like copper, for example, which was produced here in Wales. And then the black slaves then were taken on what is called the Middle Passage, this notorious journey over from West Africa to the New World in terrible conditions, crammed in these ships, and transported in the most cruel, inhuman way. And then, after arriving in the New World, they were then sold in exchange for goods, sugar especially, but other goods as well. And these were brought back then to Britain. So it is a triangular trade. And as I said, fairly few voices of protest were raised against this trade for many decades. Really until the 1780s. It's not until then that an orchestrated abolition movement arises. There were voices, of course, that were protesting prior to that, but in terms of an organized campaign, we don't really see that until the 1780s. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to look at some of the people involved in the abolition campaigns from the 1780s and 1790s onward until the 1830s especially, and look at the way they're using poetry and print as part of their campaigning then. But I do want to start with the first voice that we see raising against the slave trade prior to the orchestrated campaigning. The first voice in Welsh in print, at least, and that voice is the voice of William Williams, who we usually call William Williams of Pantycelyn, the famous Welsh hymn writer. Now, he was one of the first generation of the leaders of the Welsh Methodists. That is, this body of people that emerged as a result of the spiritual awakenings that start to affect Wales in earnest in the 1730s. And it's part of an international movement as well. That is, there are people in England also experiencing similar spiritual evangelical awakenings, people like John Wesley and George Whitefield. And then over in the States, you have people like Jonathan Edwards, and the term for that movement there is usually the Great Awakening. So they're all part of this similar spiritual evangelical awakening. And Williams, although we remember him and indeed continue to sing his hymns in Welsh, he is much wider in terms of his contribution than just his hymns. He was an important leader of the Methodists for most of the 18th century. And he also wrote a wide range of material, mainly aimed at building up the Methodist converts in their faith. And one of the books that he produces is a sort of encyclopedia, really, Pantheologia, which starts to be published in 1762, and is a history of the religions of the world. And what Williams does in this book, he looks at various parts of the world, the beliefs and religions of the people in those areas, but not just their beliefs. He also gives you some sort of idea of the geography of the area that he's discussing, the customs of the people, what they ate, how they dressed, etc. And when he comes to Western Africa, he does give his attention to the slave trade, and he condemns it in the strongest terms. He says, and this is 1762, sort of 25 years more or less before the abolition movement really starts in earnest, he says that you cannot justify this cruel trade in any way, he says. And he describes the way the Europeans come down to purchase the slaves, and he condemns the Africans for their cruel treatment of the slaves, but then he condemns in stronger terms the Europeans for their treatment, both in the Middle Passage and then after arriving in America. And his strongest criticism is towards the Spanish and their treatment, their inhuman treatment, he says, of the black slaves in mines. But he's also very critical of the British planters. And he says that the planters, he said, don't treat them very much better at all. And in the quotation I put on the screen there, you'll see that what he's arguing is that these black slaves are fully human. And he says that they've got the same God, the end of that quotation, he says they've got the same God as Europeans, as white people. And they're also, because they're fully human, they've got eternal souls. And it's important that the gospel, the Christian gospel, is preached to them, because they have the same God and for whom the same Christ died, he says. So he's putting the black slave on the same level exactly as Europeans in terms of being created in the image of God and having an eternal soul. But he also says that the planters in America, he says, are not allowing them to listen to the gospel, the Christian gospel, in case they understand, he says, that the Christian religion commands everyone to do as they would have others do unto them, the golden rule of Christianity. So you see Panthekel in there in 1762, very, very critical of the slave trade itself and the way the slaves are treated. Now, 10 years later, he publishes a book of hymns in English. We think of him mainly as a Welsh hymn writer, but he publishes a book in English of English hymns then in 1772 called Gloria in Excelsis. Now it's in 1770, quite a close fellow Methodist, Lady Huntingdon, one of the leaders of the English Methodist movement, she had inherited responsibility for an orphanage in Georgia. And on that orphanage, there were slaves. And she asked William Panthekel, would he write some English hymns to be used at the orphanage? And that's why this collection of English hymns was published in 1772. And among them, there's a hymn that became very, very popular, All Those Gloomy Hills of Darkness. It became very popular among Christian black slaves, actually, and those that had been released from slavery in later generations. But in this hymn, the first two verses are on the screen. In this hymn, what Williams is doing is looking forward, praying for the day that the Christian gospel will go abroad like a dawning light throughout the world. And the second verse then is praying that people throughout the world, all races, all nations, all peoples will see with their own spiritual eyes, if you like, the conquest that Christ had obtained on Calvary, and accept the gospel, and that the gospel then would resound from pole to pole. And the reference to black people in that first line, the Negro, possibly Williams would have had in his mind, or partly in his mind, the slaves that would be listening to this or singing this in this hymn in Georgia, in the home in the orphanage in Georgia. Now, people have said that Williams was rather compromised here because of him writing hymns to be used in a situation where slaves were being kept. But I can't see that myself. He was very, very critical of the slave trade in 10 years prior to that. And there's no reason to say that because he wrote hymns to be used in a particular context, that he actually approved of the slave trade as such. Indeed, quite the opposite in one way. You can see that what is happening in this hymn is that Williams is again emphasizing the fact that black people are equal to every other race and people, and are equally open to the Christian gospel, and indeed should be taught the Christian gospel. And this is reinforced again in a few years afterwards, when Williams is the first person to translate a slave narrative into Welsh in 1779. Now, the purpose of these slave narratives, they were telling the stories. They were biographies, really, or autobiographies in some cases, of slaves, black slaves that had become Christians. And really what they were emphasizing is that very point, that black people, black slaves, were on an equal par as human beings with white people, and that they also could accept the Christian gospel and become Christians. So you see Williams over a 20-year period here emphasizing again and again that black people are fully human, and that they can respond to the gospel, and indeed that the gospel should be preached to them, and indeed that they should be treated humanly and Christianly. Now, what happens in the 1780s, towards the end of Williams's life, you see this movement arising now, an orchestrated movement, an orchestrated campaign to abolish the slave trade. And that takes about almost a quarter of a century, from the mid-1780s through until 1807, when the British Parliament finally passes a bill to abolish the slave trade. And in that period, you see a generation now of people arising who are, well, a number of people are involved in this, of course. You know, there are political radicals involved in this campaigning. There are Quakers. There are black slaves themselves rising in revolt. But the backbone, in many ways, of this campaign for the abolition of the slave trade, the sustained campaign, if you like, were people we can describe perhaps as the heirs of the Methodist revival, the heirs of the evangelical awakening of the 18th century, the second generation, if you like, people like William Wilberforce. It's they that really drive the campaign in a sustained way. And in a Welsh context, the name that really jumps out here is a man called Morgan John Rhys. He was a radical Baptist minister of an evangelical persuasion from Glamorgan. Now, we're in a time now, by the time we come to the 1780s, of course, we're at a time when the word liberty is very prominent, or becoming increasingly prominent. We're in the time of the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, and also in spiritual terms as well. The evangelical revival is gathering more and more impetus. So there's all sorts of emphasis on liberty. Liberty in political terms by radicals, liberty in spiritual terms by evangelicals, but also the two come together, don't they, really, in the sense of liberty now, physical liberty for black slaves, and them being preached the gospel to them. And an important figure in this campaign that really starts in earnest in the late 1780s is this man called Morgan John Rhys. And a key element in this campaign was getting people to abstain from using sugar. The argument was that because people were buying sugar, slaves needed to produce the sugar. If you didn't buy the sugar from the West Indies, from the Caribbean especially, then there would be no need to have slaves at all. And you get sugar bowls being produced in this period, for example, saying things on slogans on them saying, East Indian sugar, not made by slaves. That is, they were made from the product of Asia, of East India, rather than West India, the Caribbean. And Morgan John Rhys, unfortunately, the pamphlet isn't dated, but it's probably appeared in 1792 or 1793. He produces a pamphlet there, which he's using now for this campaign to get people to stop using sugar and treacle and rum, so that the demand, if you like, for slave labor disappears in that process. And the pamphlet then it takes well, in terms of the slave trade itself, it says that slavery is something that's inhuman, that's something that's unchristian. He also then elaborates on the sufferings of the thousands of slaves in Jamaica and other places. And side by side with this pamphlet, this propaganda to get people to stop using sugar and treacle and rum, he also produces a poem. On one side, a sort of broadside sheet, where the poem is written in the first person. It's as if the black slaves in the poem, although Morgan John Rhys actually wrote the poem, it's as if the black slaves in Jamaica and the Sugar Islands, as he calls them, are addressing the people of Wales and of Britain and telling them, look at the state we're in here, and we're in that state because of the production of sugar. If you stop eating sugar, then the need for us to be here at all, if you like, ceases. And indeed, this campaign was very successful. It's said that by about the time that this pamphlet was produced in Welsh, by about 1792, there were 300,000 people in Britain who were abstaining from sugar made in the Caribbean and through slave labor. Morgan John Rhys wasn't the only person, of course. There was a Methodist, for example, around about the same time from North East Wales who produced a similar pamphlet in Welsh, and there were other voices being raised in the same period. And eventually, of course, the campaign gains enough momentum by 1807 to abolish the slave trade, the British slave trade. By then, in 1794, Morgan John Rhys had gone to the States, to Philadelphia initially, and was very vociferous there against the slave trade. He intended setting up a Welsh settlement and started on that project in Cumbria, in Pennsylvania, but died quite young in 1804, 3 years before the abolition of the slave trade that he worked so hard to achieve. Now, what happens after that is that there's a period then, especially the period of the Napoleonic Wars, up until about, well, from 1807 to about 1815, where there's nothing much happening in terms of abolition movement. What has happened in 1807 was that the slave trade had been abolished, but the institution of slavery in British territories, Jamaica and other British territories overseas, hadn't been abolished. That is, they were still keeping slaves in Jamaica and other British territories. And then from about 1820 onwards, you start again getting a second wave of campaigning now, and again led mainly by evangelicals, by a new generation now of the heirs of the Methodist revival, if you like. These people are now starting to campaign vociferously to abolish the institution of slavery in British territories. And it's important to remember, I think, that in a Welsh language context, certainly, the religious reasons are the predominant reasons that are driving these abolitionists forward. And you can see that quite clearly in this, the title of this journal, which was published in Carmarthen in 1819, a missionary chronicle, as it's called, produced partly. One of the editors was David Charles, the famous hymn writer, brother of Thomas Charles of Bala, founder of the Bible Society. And what happens from the late 18th century on, again, you get a powerful overseas missionary movement developing among Protestants in Britain. And really, the two movements, the abolition movement and the missionary movement, working side by side. You can see that very, very clearly in this journal, because above the title you have the seal of the Abolition Society there, with the famous slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This emphasis we've seen already in William Smontakelin and indeed in Morgan John Rhys's publications as well. And side by side with that is the Bible. And really the two movements there, the movement of freedom from slavery, the abolition of slavery, and spiritual freedom are going side by side here. And you see that very, very clearly now in this movement to abolish the institution of slavery in Jamaica. And now there were strong missionary movements in Jamaica in the 1820s and 1830s. Among the Wesleyan Methodists had a strong mission there, as did the Baptists. And the missionaries were very strongly in favor of abolition. And that led to sharp exchanges, to put it mildly, between them and the slave owners in Jamaica. And it's quite interesting. You can see an example on the screen there of translations into Welsh of two addresses that were given at a meeting in Exeter Hall in London in 1832 by a Wesleyan missionary and a Baptist missionary. And they were published in 1832 in English, were translated quite soon after that by a young Calvinistic Methodist from North Wales. The figure I ought to sort of underline here really is William Knibb. He did make a crucial contribution to the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, both in Jamaica itself as a missionary there, but also his tireless campaigning around Britain to gain support for the abolition movement. And interestingly, his wife Mary, who worked very closely with him in that campaigning, she was herself a Welsh speaker from Pontypool in Monmouthshire. And her favourite hymn, it said, was William's Pantycellian's Guide Me, O thou great Jehovah. And interestingly, in a Welsh context then, we have quite a lot of poetry being used in this period to enhance the abolition movement, the abolition of the institution of slavery in Jamaica. And perhaps the most interesting among them in many ways are two ballads that were produced by a man called Solomon Nuttry, the son of a slave. One of them was produced just before the emancipation of the slaves. The bill to emancipate the slaves in British territories and in Jamaica in particular went through the British Parliament in 1833, and they were actually finally enacted. The act was enacted, if you like, and the slaves were formally emancipated in the following year in 1834. And these two ballads were written and published on both sides of that passing of the act, because the first of the two, the one that the picture of it is on the screen there, History, Confession, Complaints, Greetings, and Desires of the Negroes. That tells of the terrible treatment the Negroes were having at the hands of the slave owners in Jamaica, and the terrible treatment that the missionaries were also getting at the hands of the slave owners, and the sympathy, the active sympathy that the missionaries were showing towards the black slaves. And look at that first ballad is looking forward to the emancipation of the slaves and the passing of the act. The second one then is looking back then and thanksgiving for the deliverance, as it says there, from the iron oak of the slave trade. That is after the passing of the act. Solomon Nuttry is a very interesting character. He was born in Bristol around about 1789, but he moved to North Wales and he married a girl from Anglesey in 1822 and spent most of the rest of his life then either in North Wales or in Liverpool, very possibly Welsh-speaking himself. But his wife also wrote other poetry, other ballads. It is quite possible that she actually wrote the ballads on his behalf. But they weren't the only ballads that were being used in this period. There were a number of others circulating, other poems and ballads being used quite extensively to whip up opposition to slavery and to promote the abolition movement in this period. And two of the most important and influential of them were two which appeared first of all in periodicals in 1830, but then were distributed more widely than that on ballad sheets and so on and so forth. And one of those is by Samuel Roberts of Llanbryn Mawr, or SR as is usually called, a congregational minister. And in his poem, he focuses especially on the treatment of female slaves and describes the way they're so badly treated, but especially as well, in their case, the way their children were being snatched from them. The other poem is by a man called Benjamin Price, who was a Baptist minister, and using the pseudonym for his work, Cymro Bach, the little Welshman. And he writes a very powerful propaganda poem again against slavery. And like the poem by Morgan John Rhys, what happens here is he puts the poem in the voice of the black slave himself, appealing again to the Welsh to help him, to help them, the black slaves, by promoting the abolition movement. Now, as I said, this is the second real wave of the abolition movement. The first wave is the abolition of the slave trade. Then you get the abolition of the slavery as an institution in British territories. But from 1840 on, what happens now is there's a third wave of Welsh activity, abolition activity, now focused on North America and on the United States, by people in Wales itself, but also, of course, by many of Welsh people in North America. One thinks especially of Robert Everett from Upper New York State, who leads this campaign in America, really, among Welsh people and wider, against the slavery now in the States. Now, while the poetry remains popular, a popular weapon, if you like, against slavery, in this third phase, from the 1840s through to the abolition of slavery in the States. And SR and Benjamin Price's poems are very popular in that period as well. What we do see in that period is prose becoming the prime weapon, and in particular, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in book form in 1852. It had been serialized prior to that, but it appears in book form in 1852, and is hugely popular and influential. 300,000 copies produced in English in the first year, and by the following year there were 3 book versions of the or adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin into Welsh, and as well as some serialization of the book. Extremely popular, extremely influential, of course, as a book in the States and in Britain and in Wales in particular. And the author, interestingly enough, had strong Welsh connections. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the Beecher family, were descended on one side of the family from a Mary Roberts, who probably, I think it's probably her great-grandmother, who went out from Llandewi Brefi near Tregaron, and the family were very much aware of their Welsh links. But that again is another story.